So welcome again, everyone. Memories of a Massacre. This was the name of the movie that we all watched, and I hope the film has reminded us all of the memories of the massacre. But to be honest, 1 hour, as I said, 1 hour is not enough to explain the great suffering, the sense of fear, and the attempts to survive for those who were inside the Rabba at the time. I'm thrilled to moderate this critical conversation with our fantastic group of panelists. And we will have 3 rounds of questions, and you can participate in the conversation. After the second round, there will be Q&A. So let me welcome our honorable speakers. Peter Auburn, award-winning British journalist, columnist, author, and commentator on politics for television and radio. And Dalia Fahmy, director of the International Relations and Diplomacy Program and the associate professor of political science at Long Island University. And Crispin Plant, Conservative member of the British Parliament and the former House of Commons Foreign Affairs Select Committee chairman. And Amr Magdi, senior researcher, Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. And Khalid Shalabi, eyewitness to the Rabba Massacre and journalist at Middle East Eye. Welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. Crispin, I will kick off this conversation with you. You had a distinguished participation in the film, and as far as I know, you were the only European politician who visited the Rab'a sit-in twice before the massacre in the 14th of August, and you tried to prevent the bloodshed. Tell us more about these visits and what happened.
Well, by complete coincidence, I had a former constituent who was a British national but of Egyptian extraction, and he was a hotelier by background, and he had ended up looking after President Sadat, I think. And as a result of that, he was running 2 5-star hotels in Cairo, one in Cairo, one in Luxor years later. And they were, in 1990, they were expropriated by the Mubarak regime. And by 1997, I was elected as Member of Parliament for Reigate. He came to see me to assist his effort to get some recompense for the way the hotels were taken off him. And by some miracle, the case went to the International Centre for the Settlement of Investment Disputes in New York, and under the treaty between the United Kingdom and Egypt about settlement of investment disputes, he got recompense. And during the course of that time, he had become devout, and he engaged with members of the Egyptian Islamist movement, the Brotherhood, in its widest sense. He had set up a medical centre in Cairo, and so I had this extraordinary introduction to the world of Egyptian politics. And at the beginning of July 2013, he came to see me. Actually, what he came to see me about was to try and get a visa for a family relative to give him a transplant. He needed to save his life. But it obviously gave me the opportunity then to go and visit, and I took the opportunity to go twice with him in July, and each time we were able to get into the square and to talk to the leadership who were in the square, those that hadn't been arrested. And I dare say people would be obviously people here who I met at the time there, and my comments there at the end obviously reflected my conclusions as to what I'd seen. And I left on the 31st of July 2013, and I messaged the Middle East Minister, Alistair Burt, to say we needed to démarche the Egyptians, because if they did what was plainly being planned, because all the on Egyptian television, and as I left, you could sense that the population were being prepared for the scale of bloodshed that was likely to occur if what was planned did actually happen. And at least then it appeared, it looked as though it was imminent on the 31st of July. But 2 weeks later, obviously whatever had been said between the British government and Western governments and the Egyptian military failed to have any effect, and what happened, and it's obviously a terrible outcome for the people who were there, and I think the film did huge credit to it. But it's also a pretty awful outcome for Western policy and the things that we support and supposed to support about human rights. It's a terrible rebuke.
Yeah, we will discuss in a minute the British government policy towards the Rabba Massacre. But Khalid, you were then 10 years ago. And what's your impression of the film, firstly, and what memories do you have of the massacre?
Oh, thank you so much, Osama, for having me today and for giving me opportunity to share my experience during Rabba back at this time. I just have like a few points that I want to raise regarding what we have seen in the documentary and what I have witnessed in that day. Initially, the sit-in in Rab'a Square was established by President Morsi supporters in reaction of the demonstration against his administration. But after the 3rd of July and the well-known speech of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi announcing the coup, everyone was reacting just to protect the democratic transition and what we have gained after the revolution. I have this quote that I still remember from one of my close friends from Al-Dastur Party, which led by Dr. Mohammed Al-Baradei. And after the speech, he just called me and said, Khalid, it's over. We lost. This is our last fight against the military. And we just, both of us were just silent and crying. Because we know from the very beginning that the deep state will not allow us to carry on with what we have gained after the revolution. After that, what I can remember from the massacre itself, what happened in the hospital, in Rabba Hospital. Rabba Hospital was surrounded from the very beginning, and everyone was targeted around the area and even in the entrance. Anyone who tried to rescue wounded people or trying to enter to the hospital was targeted by snipers. Even before storming the hospital, they fired tear gas inside and live bullets targeting people inside randomly. The bodies, wounded people were just all over the floors. It was just a big mass. You can see even the kids that they were trying to protect them with their families, women's, all over, everywhere, between bodies, between wounded and injured people. After they stormed the hospital, they gave a very tight time to evacuate, and they refused to evacuate anyone who can't walk by himself. I remember that one of the doctors was just pleading them to move the injuries all over the floors outside the hospital, and they just very clearly said, if you don't leave, you will die.
In the movie, one of the officers told the doctor in the field hospital, let them die.
Let them die.
Yeah.
So it was very clearly that the plan from the beginning that if what they will do, that they will burn everything, they will burn the evidence, they will burn people, even if they are still alive, just to hide what they have done during that day. The safe route after evacuating the hospital was just about 30 minutes maximum. Before and after that, it was just random shots and bullets towards them, which left a lot of casualties.
Yeah.
As I remember as well, there was one thing that 1 week before the dispersal, one of the military sources that I have contact, who was just trying to warn us about what's happening, but he just said that he was trying to assure us that everything will be aligned with the guide of the riot control, and it will be just including the use of water and tear gas, and maybe arrest of the key figures of the sit-in. He even couldn't imagine that something like that similar will happen, which show you that clearly was a well-planned operation by the military at all its level.
Yeah, regarding the plan, let me go to Amr. Amr, we watched the film. There is a story and testimony there, and Khalid told us about his testimony. But in August 2014, Human Rights Watch published one of the most important and informative reports about the massacre, titled All According to Plan, the Rabba Massacre and Mass Killing of Protesters in Egypt. Would you please remind us of the main findings of your report?
Thank you, Osama. I just dropped my mic, so I don't know if you hear me.
It's working, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for honoring me being with you here tonight, and for making time basically to remember this important day, which I think is really, there is Egypt before Rabba and Egypt after Rabba, and there will be no future for this country without addressing what happened that day. The report that Human Rights Watch produced in 2014, I didn't really have the honor of working on that report. I actually joined the organization just the month when it was released. It was other colleagues, Omar Shaker and Heba Muraif and other colleagues who worked on the report, which took almost a year-long investigation. And really a lot of researchers working on this report, interviewing almost 200 witnesses, survivors, families of the victims, lawyers, and also visiting the morgue, visiting the, doing field research in the square during the protests, analyzing satellite images, footage, and it was really a huge teamwork to come with the findings and the conclusions in almost 190 pages, one of the longest reports actually in the history of the organizations. And the main findings is basically what my former director Sardi was saying in the film, that this was a plan, a very premeditated and very intended plan to evacuate and disperse the protests, whatever the cost is. And maybe I would remind you of a few official statements. Obviously, most of the official statements were exonerating security forces from any wrongdoing, but actually, at the same time, before and after the dispersal, there were quite, I would say, mesmerizing official statements that said conveyed clearly that the government, the authorities back then in the interim government had in mind that they would kill up to 10% of the people in the square during the evacuation. That was a statement, if I remember correctly, by Mohammed Ibrahim, the interior minister. There was also a close meeting to which a few human rights activists and journalists were invited on August 5th, almost 10 days before the massacre. And in that meeting, it was conveyed to the people in the meeting that the estimated number of dead people, if dispersal happens, will be between 3,500 to 5,000 people. So it was really a plan to disperse the protest and to punish people for protesting in support of President Morsi. I think the plan was not just to actually disperse the protests, but actually to punish the people and to make an example of what comes next. And that's why I think the question about whether June 30th was a revolution or a coup is really irrelevant and a bit idiotic. It doesn't matter. Everyone is entitled to their opinion. It's a political question, whatever you support. But what happened next is what matters. And what happened next in the following weeks and months and years is actually the worst experience of authoritarianism we have experienced in Egypt and our country.
The regime is still arguing at this point, Amr. Is still saying Rab'a sit-in wasn't a peaceful protest, and they arguing your report regarding the number of atrocities in the report.
First, it was actually acknowledged by the officials during that day, if you remember, that the health ministry was issuing updates about the number of casualties, and they were counting up to 600 something. And then it was also said in a press statement, I think by El-Biblawi, Prime Minister El-Biblawi, that the number of people killed were around 1,000. And that's also what Human Rights Watch said in the report. It was likely over 1,000. I think what's important here is also to remember that the government, the authorities, commissioned two different forms of sort of like fact-finding committees. One was established by the National Council for Human Rights, and the other was established by Adli Mansour, the interim president. They never actually published the full report of that committee, but only the executive summary, I think, was published in 2016. And the report by the National Council for Human Rights was published in 2014. And actually, this government-appointed council said in the report that the government failed to provide safe exits for the protesters. It said that the government used excessive force. It said that the government failed to provide medical, emergency medical care for the wounded, which all violates, basic logic, basic morals before international norms. And I think it's really hard to dispute the numbers, and it's really the responsibility of the authorities to reveal what happened during that day. And even when Sisi became officially the president, the new constitution in 2014 had article number 241 that said that the parliament in the first session must issue a transitional justice law to actually establish the truth of what happened and to, just bring forward accountability and compensation for the victims. And it was not necessarily mentioning, or it was not necessarily addressing the Rabba Massacre, but just what happened since the 2011 revolution.
Okay, Dalia, from an academic perspective, what did Rabba mean to Egypt, Middle East, and the whole world?
So we have to remember that the election of President Morsi was the first democratic election to occur in the Middle East. And that signaled that democracy was not just possible, but that was going to remain a threat for the rest of Middle Eastern regimes. David Kirkpatrick wrote a book on the influence of Gulf countries on the military coup and the subsequent, the aftermath, but also the lead up, the funding of the civil society organization Tamarrud. And so since the 1940s, there has always been a bifurcation in the Middle East of hyper-nationalism versus Islamism. And if Islamism would win, then it's going to be at the expense of the nation. And that's why what is most significant about Rabba is not just the massacre. That day, the Independent, the headline was Egypt's Day of Shame. It's actually not. It was celebrated by Egyptians and continues to be celebrated by Egyptians. And so what you see is the rise of hyper-nationalism to face this perceived Islamist threat. And when we look at us in the greater context, this is exactly what Middle Eastern dictators from Syria all the way to Gulf countries needed. They needed for this democratic experiment to fail. Think about it not just in the context of Egypt and what it would mean. It would mean that 3 generations that had not been allowed to participate in politics could finally have a voice, a say, and a window into the future based on their interest. That legitimacy came from the people. Now, Egypt's not immune to the laws of political science, meaning when there are winners, there are also losers. For the people to win, for democracy to hold, then the military had to be removed from politics. The deep state had to be reformed. That the entire institution of governance in Egypt would have to be redefined if it was going to be in the name of the people. And if that were to happen in Egypt, it would have to happen in the rest of the Middle East. Looking at this in the greater context in terms of foreign policy, and I know we're going to get to this a little bit later, but think about what it would mean when there were critical foreign policy decisions being made by President Morsi that were saying, he said one time when the atrocities in Syria were increasing, because the levels of repression in Syria followed Egypt, right? It became a symbol. This is how you control a population. You make the violence much worse than anticipated. And President Morsi at that time had said, "Labbaiki ya Syria," right? Syria, we're coming for you. What does that mean? That the entire political regional dynamics would be redefined. And that couldn't happen. After the removal of President Morsi, we saw Israel go into Gaza. That was not going to happen if President Morsi was still president. And so if you look at the greater geopolitical positioning of Egypt vis-a-vis the rest of the Middle East, Rabba had to occur to bring the attention back to domestic politics and to redefine Egypt's position in the world, but also in the region. The people celebrating this moment. You saw David Kirkpatrick say that the press was saying these are cockroaches. The term cockroaches, right? How do you kill a cockroach? You can't spray it. You have to smash it. You have to eliminate it. This language of cockroach was used in Rwanda, was used in Srebrenica, was used in the Holocaust, was used in Cambodia. And so when you think about ultimately what this was a genocide. And if it's a genocide, which is state violence against the population to eliminate them, which is reflected in the Human Rights Report, they don't say genocide, I'm saying genocide, because that's the international definition. Then not just is this a crime against humanity, but that this needs to be tried in the International Court of Justice.
And Peter, regarding the foreign policy, a month before the Rabba Massacre, you wrote an article in The Telegraph, and I quote, "William Hague is betraying Britain's values in its response to the Egyptian coup." You strongly criticized the British foreign minister at the time. So as a journalist, how do you evaluate the British government dealing with the Rabba Massacre at time? And is anything changed during the last 10 years?
Yeah, it has to be understood. It has to be understood that Britain's foreign policy in the Middle East and across most of the rest of the world is structurally to favour dictatorship, and it's very hostile to democratic movements unless they're sponsored by the West, and certainly very hostile to movements like within political Islam and the Brotherhood. And so Hague made a very weak response to the coup d'etat, and in fact the British government has never used the term coup d'etat. And as for John Kerry, he actually welcomed the arrival of Sisi, praising him for restoring democracy to Egypt. This is what John Kerry, then the Secretary of State, managed to come up with. And so whether or not the British government was in some way complicit with the coup d'etat and what followed, it's no question that what happened fitted perfectly with British government policy. As you could see very shortly afterwards, Sisi turned up in London in 2014 to visit David Cameron. There was a very brief and perfunctory cessation of arms sales to Egypt, and they started again almost at once. There was a wretched ambassador, John Casson, who was obviously mandated by the British Foreign Office to suck up to Sisi, and they immediately started using the term terrorist about the Brotherhood activists. That became the language, particularly from visiting ministers who now like to project themselves as being very benign, like Alistair Burt, who presents himself as a bit of a saint these days, but wasn't then. He was part of the British policy of supporting Sisi and that kind of murderous despotism, which very much suited the interests of the West. And has anything changed? Of course not. That's precisely where we are now. Sisi is a valued ally of America, Britain, the West, and of course, and this is something the film didn't deal with. It was an amazing film, I thought, a brilliant film, absolutely terribly moving. Didn't deal with the role of neighbouring powers because that very interesting hint, suddenly those mysterious petrol strikes, etc. It didn't deal with the role of neighbouring powers, which are, of course, part of that Western system of government, which maybe collapsing now in what is increasingly becoming West Asia.
And Crispin, Peter talked from the journalistic perspective. As a politician, David Cameron at time investigated the political Islam, which is the idea to which many of the massacre victims belonged, to be honest, instead of investigating the regime action in the Rabba Massacre. So it's a quite strange. You chair the Foreign Affairs Committee. So how did you find the conduct of British government regarding dealing with Sisi, who admit or did the massacre, and with the political Islam?
Well, the Foreign Affairs Committee, under my chairmanship, we did an inquiry into political Islam, and in parallel, we also did effectively an inquiry into Sir John Jenkins' inquiry into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and it was perfectly clear that he had been invited to go and find the evidence to be able to nail the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organisation, and he couldn't find it. And so the conclusions in respect of the Brotherhood in the report are entirely generous. There's no he couldn't find the smoking gun, literally. And the fact that it was the embarrassing thing, if you almost actually believes in British fair play and fairness, is that we found ourselves reporting on in an investigation into the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, who had been on the receiving end of what happened at Rabba. And it had been done, as we've seen, knowingly and with malice aforethought, and they're probably rather grateful there were only 1,000 casualties, because it sounds as though they would have been prepared to tolerate 5,000. And that's really an appalling thing to think about. And some of the observations that have been made this evening about what could have been done, what ways could have been found to give Egypt some route eventually to democracy. But you closed it down once the military are soaked in blood of that scale. It's very difficult to see a way back. There is a human rights challenge to the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course there is, about individuals within, if you're going to punt a religious code in politics, you're going to have to deal with some rather difficult issues around individuals who don't accept that code. And subsequent to events of 2013, I engaged with politicalism and indeed did an inquiry into it with my committee in order to try and find the route. How do you accommodate religion in politics? How do you create a space on the democratic playing field for religious-based parties to be able to take part? What guarantees there need to be for people whose lives are going to be, if they don't conveniently fit with the religious codes that are being punted? And these are things that need to be reconciled. And to the Brotherhood's credit, certainly as far as its leadership is concerned, as far as I could see, they have made efforts not only to find ways of making those accommodations with modern society and the freedoms that are expected, but also, rather more profoundly, have managed to keep the lid on violent resistance through the ideology and the ideas that are coming out of the Brotherhood. It's probably why Egypt is not in flames now.
And Dalia, this was the UK, and what about the US? Penn Rhodes, Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration, said in the critical testimony in the film that United States turned a blind eye to the military coup, announced withholding of military aid to Egypt. Then after a while, everything returned to normal. So from your point of view, what was the vision of the Obama administration and the United States administration dealing with the Rabba Massacre and dealing with the Egyptian regime?
So if you remember, when the revolution was happening, the Obama administration was actually silent. Secretary Clinton at the time was not really talking about the street because it wasn't clear that this is what the United States wanted. It's only in President Obama's recent memoir and in Ben Rhodes looking back that, there was this beautiful thing. And President Obama currently says, if I was a young man in Egypt, I would have joined the protests, right? But they're saying that now. Back then, they were playing. There was this signaling game happening with, does the American administration support what's happening in the street? And it wasn't until just before Mubarak stepped down that the United States started talking positively about what was happening. In terms of the military coup, yes, they did say that U.S. aid would be withheld, right? And Egypt receives $1.3 billion in U.S. aid. $1 billion of it is military aid. 2013, Secretary Kerry at the time said, we will put democratic preconditions, which you need to have elections for parliament, the writing of a constitution, and then presidential elections. That did not happen in Egypt, and especially not in that order. Actually, the parliament was canceled. The democratic preconditions were removed, and aid was reinstated. And in 2014, Egypt received $1.4 billion, so even more than before. And so if you think about what we're signaling to Egyptians, young Egyptians, is that, no, we actually don't support democracy. In President Obama's final address to the United Nations General Assembly, he, in speaking about Egypt, said that the United States sees Egypt through the prism of security cooperation, flyover rights over Sinai, the Suez Canal, and the protection of the State of Israel. And that's what the United States would put its full military support behind, and counterterrorism cooperation. Things like human rights, democracy, are now up for conversations. And so what was signaled at the United Nations by President Obama was that the U.S.'s commitment to democracy and human rights is conditional. And it's conditional on the acceptance, which became very clear vis-a-vis the United States, that in the U.S., we were going to accept stability and democracy as two sides of the same coin. Democracy is messy. We're going to accept authoritarianism because that's where we're going to get stability from. But what we do know is that Egypt today is more unstable than it ever has been. The Egyptian pound used to, for $1 US, it was about 8 pounds in 2016. Today, it's 38 pounds to the dollar. We just saw a report.
In the black market. Yep.
We just saw a report come out of the World Bank that 54% of Egypt's GDP goes down to pay the interest that Egypt has taken. Our internal debt has increased threefold. Our external loans have increased threefold. The IMF has given Egypt $23 billion since 2016, and that has not been enough. And so Egypt has taken $27 billion from Gulf countries. Gulf countries today are no longer giving Egypt aid as a blank card. They now want exchange of Egyptian national properties, Egyptian national corporations. And so what's happening today is that the Egyptian government is selling Egypt piece by piece in order to get more funds. Because according to the World Bank, 70% of Egyptians live in poverty. And so if we look at stability, economically, Egypt's more unstable than it ever has been. Socially, this kind of pariah state has devolved into pariah society, where society has turned into not just othering, but those that are at all sympathetic with any type of religion are not of this new elite class that President Sisi is creating. It's not the elite of the Mubarak era. You had these new youth initiatives. He's hoping to create a new elite that's devoid of any type of religion, because now this is going to be a hyper-nationalist elite. It's not working. And so what is he doing just this week?
Okay, but if all this happened in Egypt right now, what does the stability mean for the United States administration?
It means increased repression. It means increased repression, because you can only get more stability today if you increase repression. But there's a breaking point. The biggest gift of the revolution was that the fear barrier is broken. Although fear is worse than it ever has been, today fear in Egypt is you actually can't say the sky is blue if the state does not agree that it's blue. Because if you have more than 4,000 Twitter followers and you say anything outside the national narrative, you can be arrested under terrorism charges for being against the state. And so fear has increased. And so what we know is that Egypt's unfortunately a tinderbox. 2011 showed us that change happens peacefully. My fear for Egypt is that the next cycle of change might not be so peaceful.
Okay, and Amr, over tenure, there have been repeated attempts from many people to persecute Sisi and the leaders of his regime who were involved in the massacre in 2013. This happened in the United States with Hazm al-Biblawi, the former prime minister, and this happened here in the United Kingdom with Mahmoud Hijazi, the former chief of army, among others. Nevertheless, all attempts failed. So, from your perspective, why? These all attempts failed and justice has been absent so far.
Sure, I would answer this question, but just very quickly, the previous question, I forgot to say, you were asking about the term we used usually to describe the Rabba protest, that it is largely peaceful, and that's why the use of violence was extremely disproportionate and excessive. And for some people, this is like a vague term or like hard to understand. It's either peaceful or violent. But no, it's not like that. There could be a largely peaceful protest, as in Rabba. I didn't work on the Human Rights Watch report, but I was there in the Rabba Square as a freelance journalist. I was producing for Al Jazeera English, and I spent almost 12 hours every day in the square, and I could say as a witness that it was largely peaceful. I didn't see any firearms for like almost 2 weeks working there, except on the dispersal day I saw only one firearm. And also by the end of the dispersal, by the end of the day, the Interior Ministry in Egypt held a press conference and said that they confiscated around 14 firearms. So for 14 firearms, you go ahead and kill 1,000 people. And of course, there was some violence from the protesters, whether throwing rocks or using sticks, or maybe some also had firearms. But this was not it was not a law enforcement operation to actually pinpoint those who are armed and and try to disperse the other protesters, tens of thousands of them, in other peaceful ways. There was no graduation of the use of force. And this is not like mathematics. It's not like chemistry. There are very clear rules by the UN around the use of lethal firearms by law enforcement, especially in the context of dispersing protests. And the Egyptian government, simply missed every single principle or guideline offered. For the question about accountability, I think I mentioned in my answer to the previous question that even the Egyptian constitution said there should be a law on transitional justice, which never happened. Victims were never compensated. Actually, a lot of the Rabba survivors were victimized twice or even more than twice, because a lot of them were taken to mass trials and sentenced to lengthy prison sentences or death in very, very politicized mass trials before extraordinary courts that lack any resemblance of independence. And those who were participated in the dispersal were never questioned or investigated, from the lowest ranking officer to the the officials who actually produced the orders. And instead, actually, we saw that they were getting bonuses, they were getting praise. There was a statue erected in the square in memorial of whoever actually ordered the dispersal. So I think, nationally, domestically speaking, justice in Egypt is far from reach. Sisi's regime has actually co-opted the judiciary in ways that Mubarak never did. Maybe even Nasser never did that extent of co-option of the judiciary. Outside of Egypt, internationally, just in line with what our distinguished speakers have said about the just the lack of, to put it in the, I would say the mildest way, the lack of enthusiasm to defend democracy in Egypt, there was not really a reaction to hold Sisi's government accountable to these serious crimes that we said they are crimes against humanity. And that means they have actually universal jurisdiction laws in many Western countries that they could use against the Egyptian officials, and it also means that these crimes could be prosecuted before International Criminal Court if Egypt was a member of the Roma Statute. Unfortunately, Morsi, Allah yarhamu, he never actually signed the Roma Statute, which would have actually meant a lot for the Rabba survivors. The other way is to produce some sort of a statement in the Security Council and order the country or the officials to be taken to the International Criminal Court, which would never happen in the case of Sisi's regime in Egypt. So what remains is the universal jurisdiction laws in many of these countries, like the UK and France and other countries. Unfortunately, the diplomatic impunity which Egyptian officials enjoy, or any officials in any country for that matters, automatically ceases any sort of investigations or any sort of like arrest orders, even though there were actually some quite serious attempts. We saw that Sisi, for example, canceled a visit to South Africa in 2016, if I remember, because of it was very, very unlikely for him to be arrested, but just because there was strong laws in South Africa about this, and it could actually go into an actual investigation. I also remember, I think, Egyptian officials canceled visits to the UK in 2015 and 16 for the same reason. After that, we haven't seen much attempts. I think the diplomatic impunity is really a big hurdle, but also the lack of political will on the part of the governments in those Western countries. Yep. We have seen, it wasn't just the U.S. that have very quickly resumed the military aid to Egypt. It was also the European countries, members of the EU, despite two statements by the European Commission for Foreign Affairs saying that all military equipment and export licenses to Egypt have to be revised. That these statements were in 2013 and 2014, but we have seen maybe over 12 European countries exporting arms to Egypt, including firearms and small arms that are used by the police to violently oppress the opposition. Some countries use a lot of these justifications to justify why they transport weapons to Egypt. So they say, for example, we transport only big weapon systems that are not used for internal repression, like, for example, the French Mistral or Rafale fighters. But actually, a lot of European countries give firearms to the Egyptian police. This comes from Italy, for example, from Belgium, and from many other countries. So if they are doing that, there's no wonder why it's not actually possible to activate the universal jurisdiction laws in these countries against Egyptian officials.
Peter, we were talking about the action of Western countries to the justice attempt. If we talk about the Western media coverage after the Rabba Massacre, we all watched Craig Summers, the security chief at Sky, testimony about his colleague, his cameraman, Michael Dean, who was shot, killed in Rabba Massacre. How do you see the media coverage of British ministry media here regarding this Sky cameraman?
Well, obviously, Mike Dean is a very brave man who put himself in harm's way and was killed. It worries, but it does worry me that the dominance of this kind of narrative of the fate of a British journalist or a Western journalist. I felt very strongly at the time that there was a systemic neglect of the fate of Egyptian journalists. There is a prioritization of the quite upsetting and shaming if you're a Western journalist. You somehow place the fate of a white Western journalist much higher than of the countless Egyptian journalists who were locked up, tortured, killed, and so on. So I was very struck. Just one other point on the Western media coverage. The Tiananmen Square comparison you made there, Crispin. But of course, if you compare the coverage of Tiananmen Square and how the BBC went absolutely bonkers on the subject, and it was the epic moment in the history of the world, and the muted response, always the Western media reflecting the official foreign policy position of Western governments, the very muted response to Rabba once again showed that it was something which I think calls into question the integrity, I should say, of a great deal of British foreign reporting and Western foreign reporting.
And talking about journalism and the value of journalism, the film showed a video clip of an Egyptian media figure loyal to the regime inciting the killing of the protesters in Rabba. So what's your comment on such a level of journalism?
Well, that isn't journalism at all. That is the sort of journalism which Goebbels approved of. Yes. That is propaganda, vicious propaganda of death. But only criminal. And criminal, yes.
Yeah. And Khaled, 10 years ago, you are witness Rabba. Today you are a journalist. The Middle East Eye covers the stories, reports on human rights and migration issues. So what impact the Rabba massacre had on your life?
Just before that, I have 2 points to follow up with Amr and Peter about the kind of violation that might happen during the dispersal from the people or civilians towards what was happening from the forces during the dispersal. It just was a normal resistance that we have done all over the revolution, from Tahrir Square till other events, Muhammad Mahmoud, Al-Abbasiyya, and all over. So basically it wasn't something different. And even the military source that I have contact with, like, he was trying to warn us about the dispersal. He said that we know literally all the details and everything inside the sit-in. So they have the whole information about everything inside. If they have any doubt about kind of weapons inside, I'm sure that they could manage to expose it to the media, but they didn't have. And the other point about targeting journalists, during the dispersal, we have friends and colleagues who have been targeted and shot dead. Habiba Ahmed and Mus'ab al-Shami. And before that, in the Republic Guards events, Ahmed Asim. And they all just shot dead during their work, during their coverage of the events, to show what's happening on the ground. Myself was kidnapped during the dispersal by forces and have been tortured, and they have tried just to take my camera, take everything that I had, and even to cut between my fingers with knives. So basically, the Egyptian journalists during the events, the virtual events since the revolution until the coup and what happened after Rab'a, there was a primary target to the regime on the grounds, and they just been silent by all the ways and all the means. Regarding your question, so basically until today, during our reporting, we still hearing new stories about what happened, which clearly demonstrates the massive impacts of that day on all of us. Egypt after Rab'a is nothing like before. We are talking about thousands of political prisoners are still inside prisons in a very poor and like critical conditions. We are talking about media restricted, freedom of speech not exist anymore. Just anyone who tried to speak out, like, it just been silent. The military took over the state. They had the full control of everything, economics, media, investments, constructions, everything. Even now, the practice of the military and police forces that we are witnessing now, it's much, much worse than we have witnessed during Mubarak's era and before the revolution. So basically, Rab'a was just a turning point that was like establishment of the state of affairs that just resulted what we are witnessing now.
It was a turning point for the country.
For the whole country.
It was a turning point for you?
Everyone. So just like you are witnessing people inside prisons or in the exiles, people separated from their families all over the world. The one family are like just split in all over the world, like in Canada, in US, in Turkey, in the UK. Myself, I have all my families, I haven't met them like since like 5 years, and everyone is just in one in a different region. This is exactly applied for thousands of Egyptians after what happened.
Thank you, Osama. Maybe I just have like a brief comments on the various questions that were posed. I think before I came to the human rights as a professional, human rights defender, I was working in journalism, and also I was a political activist. And I think having spent almost over a decade in professional human rights activism, really gifted me with the perception that it is actually very beneficial to look at things that happened in Egypt and other Arab countries after the uprisings with a human rights prism or a human rights perspective. It really helps us understand and maybe also like express things in a more calm way and also perceive what others say in a calmer way. And I think all political parties in Egypt, including the Brotherhood, secular parties, leftist parties, were guilty, very guilty of, and contributed to two lethal sins that really antagonizes any sense of healthy politics, which is polarization and essentialism. And I think what happened in Egypt between 2011 and 2013 was really a huge gap of trust between political forces, and I think the Muslim Brotherhood contributed to that as well. And one of our distinguished audience members said that the Muslim Brotherhood was the only player who believed in democracy, but actually we saw and witnessed a lot of actions and statements by the Brotherhood after Mubarak stepped down that were very anti-democratic. They have effectively participated in what they are blaming the secular forces for in the Rabba massacre. The secular and leftist forces supported the military when they massacred pro-Morsi supporters in Rabba Square, but the Muslim Brotherhood also supported the SCAF, the interim government that was basically the military after Mubarak when they massacred protesters in Mohammed Mahmoud, in Maspiru, and the cabinet massacre. Or at least they were not as condemning of the events, or at least they were also spreading what was circulated by the SCAF media back then, which basically is demonizing the protesters and calling them thugs, calling them scums, justifying virginity tests of the female protesters. And I think when you look at the things from a human rights perspective, you see that every part was guilty of something, and I think that helps you overcome some of the, just the very narrow corners that ideology usually pushes people to. And I think that doesn't necessarily make people like evil, but it doesn't help them understand what went wrong in order to actually arrive at a correct diagnosis and therefore a correct solution. And the correct solution, in my opinion, is when there is another democratic transition in Egypt, is to actually push forward a number of very urgent democratic reforms, legislative reforms, democratic reforms that actually establishes the institutions in the country. And I think the very brief time that the Brotherhood held the majority in the government in Egypt between 2011 and 2013, they failed to do so. And I think I lived in Tunisia for 2 years as well, and I could see that also political forces in Tunisia were guilty of the same. They were more keen on, let's say, assuming power and getting their men in the state institutions rather than reforming these institutions. And there were very clear like abusive laws that could have been taken down very easily, very quickly in the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated parliament in Egypt. For example, also ratifying the Roma Statute, ratifying a few other international treaties, like the Treaty Against Enforced Disappearance, for example. Egypt is not, signatory of that treaty. There were a lot of, there was no lack of, I would say, ideas or thoughts or suggestions. Actually, a lot of civil society organizations and independent activists offered a lot of useful ideas how to reform the police institution, how to approach the military, because you can't also remove a military that ruled the country for 70 years from power overnight. That has to come gradual, and it has to come with certain concessions. So I think looking at things from a human rights perspective really helps us overcome sometimes what our ideologies blind us from seeing. And in June 30 events and then the July 3rd and then the Rabba Massacre, it's really important to look at things from a human rights perspective. And I don't really care when people say June 30 was a revolution. Okay, if that's your opinion, that's fair. You are entitled to that. But actually, now, if I say that June 30 was a coup in Egypt, I will go to prison. So you can't, there is no revolution that is followed by such, extreme, nationwide, systematic repression of all basic rights. And
coming back at you, from a human rights perspective, there is no comparison of any kind between the barbarity which happened at Rabba and the occasional mistakes which took place under the Brotherhood. None at all. Cannot be compared from a human rights perspective. The other thing I'd say is Morsi had only been going for about a year. He had made a few mistakes. He was the first ever democratically elected leader of Egypt, and he was put out of business by the army. He had no right to do that at all. And this sort of relativism we're getting from your corner, I find a bit difficult. And just one final observation to go back to the question from the audience. One thing which really hurts me about this is it was a democratic movement, is a democratic movement. And if you were reading Al-Qaeda literature at the time, which I studied quite carefully, you had Zawahiri, of course, an Egyptian, saying, look, it's completely fake. The West will never allow it. The army will never allow it. Democracy has no chance. It's just a fake. And that you don't believe those guys in the Brotherhood. And I've talked to jihadists who were with the Brotherhood then, and they concluded that the only way forward is Al-Qaeda. And that was the message of the coup. And that is, I don't know whether that is still the great fear, because I haven't been to Egypt for 10 or 11 years. But that I think is what political Islam is, wonderfully constructive movements right across North Africa and the Middle East, hated by the despotisms which are supported by the West. John Jenkins, a poodle if ever there was one, he couldn't manage to amass the evidence that MBZ persuaded David Cameron to mount that inquiry. And I feel much more positive about political Islam than I think anybody else on the panel, actually. But I also fear very much that the West's complicity in the disabling of political Islamic movements are opening the way to very sinister and dangerous and bloodthirsty movements.
I will say thank you for everyone make this event happen. Many thanks to our speakers, Peter Auburn, Dalia Fahmy, Crispin Plant, Amr Magdi, Khaled Shalabi, and Elizabeth Nagnet. And thank you for our great audience and for our volunteers. We will never forget the Rabba Massacre, and we will keep demanding democracy, freedom, and social justice as we believe in Egypt Watch. As you can see, our slogan, Egypt deserves better. Thank you.